Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to present at the Early Childhood Voices 2022 conference. My name is Deborah Stockton, and my topic today is harnessing collaborative research approaches to adapt early childhood service models for rural communities. So, why is rural child and family health service development important? Well, we know there is a plethora of evidence now as to the importance of the first 2,000 days in a child's life. In fact, for their lifelong trajectory in terms of health and social outcomes and educational outcomes. But we also know there are poorer health outcomes for families living in rural communities impacted by geographic isolation, socioeconomic disadvantage, climate change, drought, and floods. There have been calls to action at an international, national and state level to take service models that have been established in well-resourced settings and have been found to be effective and to adapt these for less well-resourced settings, including looking at how these can be adapted for the widely differing needs of rural communities. I work for an organisation called Tresillian, who have been around for over 100 years. We are the largest specialist child and family health organisation in Australia. And if I showed you this map pre-October 2015, you would have only seen the 4 sites there around metropolitan Sydney. So over the last 7 years, we've undertaken an extensive journey as we have reached out to extend the reach of services for families in rural and regional areas in New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. And this has given us the opportunity to think deeply about the way that we go about this. How do we take essentially an Australian metropolitan service model for specialist child and family health services and implement these in other very diverse settings? And importantly, what elements of the service model might need to be flexible, what might need to be stable, and what matters most to consumers and stakeholders? So this became my PhD question for my research, and I've just, in the last couple of weeks, been notified that my thesis passed examination. So I started off with an integrative review, and I looked at rural community health literature, looking particularly for evidence of the building blocks for the strengthening of health service systems, articulated in a framework by the World Health Organization. And this has now been published in Health Science Reports. I'll draw your attention to 2 of the key findings, and that is that service delivery, service establishment is only going to be as effective as the community engagement. In fact, this needs to be collaborative community engagement. And at a leadership and governance level, we need local inclusive stakeholder participation in decision-making and, importantly, cross-sectoral, cross-agency collaboration. So this informed my research design, and I used participatory action research, or PAR, because it's shorter to say, with a particular community group in a part of rural New South Wales to look at the fit of a particular service model for that local context, taking the findings of that first PAR study and those of the integrative review, and I distilled a set of potential elements to consider when adapting a service model for a different context. These were presented to through a Delphi study to an expert panel, which included, importantly, parents. Parents were participants throughout all of these 3 studies. And through the Delphi study, we were able to distill out and refine what are the key elements that need to be considered when adapting a service model, a child and family health service model for a different contextual setting. And this helped to develop up a draft framework, which was then refined through another PAR study in a different part of rural New South Wales, and the outcome being the framework that I'll explain to you a little bit about in a few moments. But why use collaborative research approaches? Well, both PAR and Delphi seek to address those power differentials that are often there between researchers and participants. They also foster inclusivity, with participants in PAR being situated as partners in the research, and in Delphi as experts on the focus of the study. And in this way, researchers and community members learn from each other. And this enables co-design of adaptations and contextualisation of service models for the needs of a local community. I'm going to share with you now some of the findings from the 3 studies, and you will hear the voices of the parents in this case. And so looking at the first study, which looked at the fit of the service model for the particular context, there were 6 key themes that emerged. What parents want. Parents want some knowledge and information about what's normal. What do I expect when I have a baby or a toddler? And where do I go for help? And in theme 2 was very focused on breaking down barriers. If there is a referral process to a particular service, or the way that they access it is convoluted, this is only going to create a barrier. With one participant saying, families need the referral pathway to be easy because it's hard being a parent without throwing in complex families and financial hardship, exhaustion and mental health, and the stigma. It needs to be easy for them. And the third theme about being flexible and responsive in the way that we deliver services. The fourth theme was around real life is messy. And I know that's not a revelation, but it helps us to ground ourselves when we're looking at a service model, whether it be in the early childhood learning and education sector, or whether it be health. It needs to be reality-based. And one of the participants said, it's really lovely and really clear on paper, but it's messy when we're dealing with human beings. And the fifth and sixth themes were around working together, building capacity, and the enablers through sharing of information. In the Delphi study, which has now been published in the Journal of Health and Social Care in the Community, there were participants who were parents, consumers, health providers, non-government organisations, government and academics. And there was a high rate of consensus, with mean scores, the standard deviation of the mean scores being less than 1. And you can see from the pie graph that of the 107 initial potential elements to be considered, 80 were retained in round 1 and a further 17 brought back into the fold in round 2. I analysed these using a well-known frame from implementation science called CMO, context, mechanism, outcome. And I changed this around a little bit in light of the feedback from the first PAR study. And so, because in particular, there were questions asked about whose outcomes are we measuring? Who are they meaningful for? Are they meaningful to the parents and the community, or just to us as service providers? And so the beginnings of the framework became context, outcomes expected, mechanism, and evaluate outcomes. And the third study was the piloting of this draft framework. And so you can see here that I've taken a PAR cycle and I've overlaid the beginnings of this new framework and applied it to the PAR cycle there. And in between, also looking at data to check in about our emerging collective understanding of the community context. So in workshop 1, we looked particularly at trying to understand what might be the priorities and needs for families in our local community. And there were 2 key themes that emerged. One, that parents need parents, the impact of isolation, and we know that this has been further exacerbated by COVID-19. But it was there to begin with nonetheless. The importance of peer and social support, parent to parent, and safe places for parents to meet. And in theme 2, connecting parents with services. They needed accessible service information that was easy to understand, the challenges specific to rural families, and the way that we as service providers can join together to create service connections and make it easier for families. When looking at how to adapt and implement an adapted service model, there were 4 themes. And the first was the waltz. One of the participants shared her thoughts about when a new service or program comes to town, it's a bit like they and the community getting to know each other as part of a dance. They're getting to know one another, they're being guided by the community pace, so the toing and froing, the taking turns at taking the lead, all helps to develop that relationship and that understanding so that we can adapt for that community. There needed to be strong but flexible connections, reassuring, responsive connections between the service and the community and between service providers. But these needed to be dynamic because the community changes over time. The balancing act refers to the balancing act that we all need to undertake as we try to balance flexibility versus productivity, So how are we going to maximise the use of our resources, but make sure that we're delivering in a way that is going to be meaningful and helpful for the community? We need to keep it real, but we need to keep checking in as well. Have we got this balance right? And recalibrating. And creating a safety net was the fourth theme, about working together, and as we come to a common understanding of each other's needs as service providers and what we have to, the roles that we can play, the intersection, we create a safety net for families. But importantly, we also create a safety net for each other. And integral to this is building of trust, but trust takes time to build. And one of the key elements to that is showing a commitment to staying for the long haul. So one of the key outputs of my research has been Cascades framework for the collaborative adaptation of service models for child and family health in diverse settings. And the development of the framework has now been published in the Journal of Child Healthcare. And the Cascades framework uses the analogy of a waterfall. And just as the waterfall flows over the tiers of the cascades, in the same way, the information that we obtain as we join together as a collaborative community group flows to the next step of the process. So we start with context, taking our time to develop a very comprehensive understanding of the local context, but at the same time, ensuring that we're not only looking at needs and priorities, but the strengths and resources of that community. Looking again at the expected outcomes, what difference are we wanting to make and see if this service model is effective? And then we've changed the word mechanism to model here, from feedback from the participants, that at this point we are really pulling the model apart to see what works well for this community and what we're going to adapt. And then just as the water at the bottom of a waterfall slows, so too we will slow down and take our time to consider all that's gone before, develop our action plan and our evaluation strategy, and reflect on the process. But Cascades is more than just a framework. It is a toolkit, a suite of tools to support place-based in-community co-design of service model adaptations. There are facilitation guides, focus questions and checklists. And when I asked the PAR group to rate the helpfulness of the framework, they provided a score of, there was a median score of 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. These are some of the different resources in the toolkit. I'm working with a graphic artist to bring those to life even more, but the content is there and ready. And if you'd like to know more, please reach out to me. I'd just like to note that I used everything that all the research was underpinned by realist evaluation to enable real-time change. So as findings emerged, they were shared with Tresillian and joint governance committees, local health districts, and they made their way into service plans. There was also the introduction of a self-referral option. There were awareness raising campaigns. There was a scale up of telehealth ahead of the COVID pandemic and the building of those interagency relationships. And also the past cycles continue now. So there's been capacity building and they are being led by local clinicians. And so in conclusion, when improving access to services for rural families, this research has shown that an established service model is helpful, but there are caveats. The keys lay in flexibility, consultation, pro-social organisational behaviour. This is the altruism that we often see in those who are working with families in rural areas, collaboration and integration, and all this enabling community co-design. But this takes time to build a strong understanding of local context to inform the adaptations responsive to the community's needs and their cultural context. And importantly, that service models must be reflective of real life. I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors from UTS, my colleagues at Tresillian, and the study participants who gave so generously of their time, perspectives, and insights. And I'll leave you with a quote: "Start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you're doing the impossible." Thank you.